Democratic peace theory is a theory which posits that democracies are hesitant to engage in armed conflict with other identified democracies. In contrast to theories explaining war engagement, it is a theory of peace, outlining motives that dissuade state-sponsored violence. Some theorists prefer terms such as mutual democratic pacifism or inter-democracy non-aggression hypothesis, so as to clarify that a state of peace is not singular to democracies, but rather that it is easily sustained between democratic nations. Among proponents of the democratic peace theory, several factors are held as motivating peace between liberal states. Democratic leaders are forced to accept culpability for war losses to a voting public. Publicly accountable statesmen are more inclined to establish diplomatic institutions for resolving international tensions. Democracies are less inclined to view countries with adjacent policy and governing doctrine as hostile. Democracies tend to possess greater public wealth than other states, and therefore eschew war to preserve infrastructure and resources. Those who dispute this theory often do so on grounds that it conflates correlation with causation, and that the academic definitions of democracy and war can be manipulated so as to manufacture an artificial trend. History. Though the democratic peace theory was not rigorously or scientifically studied until the 1960s, the basic principles of the concept had been argued as early as the 1700s in the works of philosopher Immanuel Kant and political theorist Thomas Paine. Kant foreshadowed the theory in his essay Perpetual Peace, written in 1795. Although he thought that a world with only constitutional republics was only one of several necessary conditions for a perpetual peace, Kant's theory was that a majority of the people would never vote to go to war, unless in self-defense. Therefore, if all nations were republics, it would end war, because there would be no aggressors. In earlier but less cited works, Thomas Paine made similar or stronger claims about the peaceful nature of republics. Paine wrote in Common Sense in 1776, "The republics of Europe are all in peace." Paine argued that kings would go to war out of pride in situations where republics would not. Democracy in America, by French historian and social scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, also argued that democratic nations were less likely to wage war. Dean Babst, a criminologist, was the first to do statistical research on this topic. His academic paper supporting the theory was published in 1964 in Wisconsin Sociologist. He published a slightly more popularized version, in 1972, in the trade journal Industrial Research. Both versions initially received little attention. Melvin Small and J. David Singer responded, they found an absence of wars between democratic states with two marginal exceptions, but denied that this pattern had statistical significance. This paper was published in the Jerusalem Journal of International Relations, which finally brought more widespread attention to the theory, and started the academic debate. A 1983 paper by political scientist Michael W. Doyle contributed further to popularizing the theory. Rudolph J. Rummel was another early researcher and drew considerable lay attention to the subject in his later works. Maoz and Abdelali extended the research to lesser conflicts than wars. Bremer and Maoz and Russett found the correlation between democracy and peacefulness remained significant after controlling for many possible confounding variables. This moved the theory into the mainstream of social science. Supporters of realism in international relations and others responded by raising many new objections. Other researchers attempted more systematic explanations of how democracy might cause peace, and of how democracy might also affect other aspects of foreign relations such as alliances and collaboration. There have been numerous further studies in the field since these pioneering works. Most studies have found some form of democratic peace exists, although neither methodological disputes nor doubtful cases are entirely resolved. Definitions. Research on the democratic peace theory has to define democracy and peace. Defining democracy. Democracies have been defined differently by different theorists and researchers. This accounts for some of the variations in their findings. Some examples. Small and Singer define democracy as a nation that holds periodic elections in which the opposition parties are as free to run as government parties, allows at least 10% of the adult population to vote, and has a parliament that either controls or enjoys parity with the executive branch of the government. Doyle requires that liberal regimes have market or private property economics, they have policies that are internally sovereign, they have citizens with juridical rights, and they have representative governments. Either 30% of the adult males were able to vote, or it was possible for every man to acquire voting rights as by attaining enough property. He allows greater power to hereditary monarchs than other researchers. For example, he counts the rule of Louis Philippe of France as a liberal regime. Ray requires that at least 50% of the adult population is allowed to vote and that there has been at least one peaceful, constitutional transfer of executive power from one independent political party to another by means of an election. This definition excludes long periods often viewed as democratic. For example, the United States until 1800, India from independence until 1979, and Japan until 1993 were all under one-party rule, and thus would not be counted under this definition. Rummel states that, by democracy is meant liberal democracy, where those who hold power are elected in competitive elections with a secret ballot and wide franchise, where there is freedom of speech, religion, and organization, and a constitutional framework of law to which the government is subordinate and that guarantees equal rights. Non-binary classifications. The above definitions are binary, classifying nations into either democracies or non-democracies. Many researchers have instead used more finely grained scales. One example is the Polity data series, which scores each state on two scales, one for democracy and one for autocracy, for each year since 1800, as well as several others. The use of the Polity data has varied. Some researchers have done correlations between the democracy scale and belligerence, others have treated it as a binary classification by calling all states with a high democracy score and a low autocracy score democracies, yet others have used the difference of the two scores, sometimes again making this into a binary classification. Young democracies. Several researchers have observed that many of the possible exceptions to the democratic peace have occurred when at least one of the involved democracies was very young. Many of them have therefore added a qualifier, typically stating that the peacefulness apply to democracies older than 3 years. Rummel argues that this is enough time for democratic procedures to be accepted, and democratic culture to settle in. Additionally, this may allow for other states to actually come to the recognition of the state as a democracy. Mansfield and Snyder, while agreeing that there have been no wars between mature liberal democracies, state that countries in transition to democracy are especially likely to be involved in wars. They find that democratizing countries are even more warlike than stable democracies, stable autocracies, or even countries in transition towards autocracy. So, they suggest caution in eliminating these wars from the analysis, because this might hide a negative aspect of the process of democratization. A reanalysis of the earlier studies' statistical results emphasizes that the above relationship between democratization and war can only be said to hold for those democratizing countries where the executive lacks sufficient power, independence, and institutional strength. A review cites several other studies finding that the increase in the risk of war in democratizing countries happens only if many or most of the surrounding nations are undemocratic. If wars between young democracies are included in the analysis, several studies and reviews still find enough evidence supporting the stronger claim that all democracies, whether young or established, go into war with one another less frequently, while some do not. Defining war. Quantitative research on international wars usually define war as a military conflict with more than 1,000 killed in battle in 1 year. This is the definition used in the Correlates of War project, which has also supplied the data for many studies on war. It turns out that most of the military conflicts in question fall clearly above or below this threshold. Some researchers have used different definitions. For example, where defines war as more than 200 battle deaths. Russet, when looking at ancient Greece, only requires some real battle engagement, involving on both sides forces under state authorization. Militarized interstate disputes, in the Correlates of War project classification, are lesser conflicts than wars. Such a conflict may be no more than military display of force with no battle deaths. MIDs and wars together are militarized interstate conflicts, or MICs. MIDs include the conflicts that precede a war, so the difference between MIDs and MICs may be less than it appears. Statistical analysis and concerns about degrees of freedom are the primary reasons for using MIDs instead of actual wars. Wars are relatively rare. An average ratio of 30 MIDs to 1 war provides a richer statistical environment for analysis. Monadic versus dyadic peace. Most researches regarding the dyadic peace, that democracies do not fight one another. Very few researchers have supported the monadic peace, that democracies are more peaceful in general. There are some recent papers that find a slight monadic effect. Muller and Wolf, in Listingham, agree that democracies on average might be slightly, but not strongly, less warlike than other states, but general, monadic explanations is neither necessary nor convincing. They note that democracies have varied greatly in their belligerence against non-democracies. Possible exceptions. Some scholars support the democratic peace on probabilistic grounds. Since many wars have been fought since democracies first arose, we might expect a proportionate number of wars to have occurred between democracies. If democracies fought each other as freely as other pairs of states, but proponents of democratic peace theory claim that the number is much less than might be expected. However, opponents of the theory argue this is mistaken and claim there are numerous examples of wars between democracies. Historically, cases commonly cited as exceptions include the Sicilian expedition, the Spanish-American War, and more recently the Kargil War. Doyle cites the Pakisha War and the Lebanese Air Force's intervention in the Six-Day War. The total number of cases suggested in the literature is at least 50. The data set Bramer was using showed one exception. The French-Thai War of 1940, Gleditch sees the state of war between Finland and UK during World War II, as a special case, which should probably be treated separately. An incidental state of war between democracies during large multipolar wars. However, the UK did bomb Finland, implying the war was not only on paper. Page Fortner discusses the 1974 Turkish invasion of Cyprus and the Kargil War as exceptions, finding the latter to be the most significant. However, the status of these countries as being truly democratic is a matter of debate. For instance, in Spain in 1898, two parties alternated in the government in a controlled process known as El Turno Pacifico, and the caciques, powerful local figures, were used to manipulate election results. And as a result, resentment of the system slowly built up over time and important nationalist movements as well as unions started to form. Limiting the theory to only truly stable and genuine democracies leads to a very restrictive set of highly prosperous nations with little incentive in armed conflict that might harm their economies, in which the theory might be expected to hold virtually by definition. One advocate of the democratic peace explains that his reason to choose a definition of democracy sufficiently restrictive to exclude all wars between democracies are what might be disparagingly termed public relations. Students and politicians will be more impressed by such a claim than by claims that wars between democracies are less likely. Statistical difficulties due to newness of democracy. One problem with the research on wars is that, as the realist Mearsheimer put it, democracies have been few in number over the past 2 centuries, and thus there have been few opportunities where democracies were in a position to fight one another, especially if using a strict definition of democracy, as by those finding no wars. Democracies have been very rare until recently. Even looser definitions of democracy, such as Doyle's, find only a dozen democracies before the late 19th century, and many of them short-lived or with limited franchise. Freedom House finds no independent state with universal suffrage in 1900. Wayman, a supporter of the theory, states that, if we rely solely on whether there has been an interdemocratic war, it is going to take many more decades of peace to build our confidence in the stability of the democratic peace. Studying lesser conflicts. Many researchers have reacted to this limitation by studying lesser conflicts instead, since they have been far more common. There have been many more MIDs than wars. The Correlates of War project counts several thousand during the last 2 centuries. A review lists many studies that have reported that democratic pairs of states are less likely to be involved in MIDs than other pairs of states. Another study finds that after both states have become democratic, there is a decreasing probability for MIDs within a year, and this decreases almost to zero within 5 years. When examining the interliberal MIDs in more detail, one study finds that they are less likely to involve third parties, and that the target of the hostility is less likely to reciprocate. If the target reciprocates, the response is usually proportional to the provocation, and the disputes are less likely to cause any loss of life. The most common action was seizure of material or personnel. Studies find that the probability that disputes between states will be resolved peacefully is positively affected by the degree of democracy exhibited by the lesser democratic state involved in that dispute. Disputes between democratic states are significantly shorter than disputes involving at least one undemocratic state. Democratic states are more likely to be amenable to third-party mediation when they are involved in disputes with each other. In international crises that include the threat or use of military force, one study finds that if the parties are democracies, then relative military strength has no effect on who wins. This is different from when non-democracies are involved. These results are the same also if the conflicting parties are formal allies. Similarly, a study of the behavior of states that joined ongoing militarized disputes reports that power is important only to autocracies. Democracies do not seem to base their alignment on the power of the sides in the dispute. Conflict initiation. Most studies have looked only at who is involved in the conflicts and ignored the question of who initiated the conflict. In many conflicts, both sides argue that the other side was initiator. Several researchers, as described in, have argued that studying conflict initiation is of limited value, because existing data about conflict initiation may be especially unreliable. Even so, several studies have examined this. Reiter and Stamm argue that autocracies initiate conflicts against democracies more frequently than democracies do against autocracies. Quackenbush and Rudy, while confirming Reiter and Stamm's results, find that democracies initiate wars against non-democracies more frequently than non-democracies do to each other. Several following studies have studied how different types of autocracies with different institutions vary regarding conflict initiation. Personalistic and military dictatorships may be particularly prone to conflict initiation, as compared to other types of autocracy such as one-party states, but also more likely to be targeted in a war having other initiators.